Hey guys, I'm Matt at MrMaple. Today we had Blue Ridge Community College coming and visiting, taking a small tour of the nursery, and it was a propagation class. They actually asked us to do some demonstrations on ginkgo and maple propagation and from seed. So we did a small demonstration here on grafting as well as seed production.
And so this is the process that every 1 gallon or tree that you get from MrMaple goes through. So it's kind of cool for you to see this full process. We thought we'd bring it to you today because it's something that's kind of unique and different, and people don't realize all the steps of the process that happens whenever you have a tree that gets to you and comes to you in the mail, everything that went into creating that tree.
Yeah, these are basically just some small steps. Now we're shooting this in November. We're not set up for full production right now. Typically we would do a much more in-depth thing, and we actually may do a full grafting video later in the winter when we're doing our full production. We have our greenhouses set up. We want to do a basic small demonstration, again out of season, but to show you guys what we do with grafting.
Like, subscribe, and share this video with your gardening friends. I guarantee you they'll love this video too.
So today we're going to go over a little bit about how we do like our seed production and give you a brief little grafting demonstration.
And so this is going to basically tell everybody here how a Japanese maple graft and everything is made and the full process this goes into, because it's a long process.
Right. Like
we talked about earlier, it's a 3 to 4 year process, and a lot of people just see a fresh graft and they're like, oh, you know, that's a very young plant. Well, it could be 3 or 4 years old. So first off, what we're going to talk about here is the actual seed process, because to do everything first, we have to have a rootstock. Now you can order in rootstock, obviously, but a lot of the times when we're grafting, we're collecting seed and then growing that on to then propagate.
What started out our nursery are trees my grandmother planted in the 1950s. She was collecting Japanese maples there in the 1950s. And she was using a basic Acer palmatum subspecies palmatum, which is a basic small leaf green, which is pretty much your small leaf green Japanese maple. You'll see them around a lot. They're common from seed, and they do come fairly uniform from seed. You'll get some diversity there, but they do come fairly uniform that way.
And so this is actually a trick my dad started doing years ago. He used to use these trays to root rhododendron, and then he decided to start using them for Japanese maple, growing Japanese maple seed. And then we realized that they give really good drainage. They avoid fungus, which a lot of the plastic trays get a lot of fungus a lot easier than something that's wooden and raises up a little bit. And then we line it with a sometimes newspaper. This is actually butcher paper you get at Sam's. And then you can actually use all types of mix. This is just our regular potting mix. It's about a 80% pine bark, 15% peat, 5% perlite, somewhere around there on the mix. And it's just really airy and fluffy. You can get a germination mix, which we use from time to time.
Pretty similar though.
Yeah, very, very similar. And we just spread this out pretty evenly. And we want to get it all the way around in there.
So we've actually already collected the seed. We did a whole video on collecting seeds, so you can watch that if you want to watch that part. Pretty self-explanatory though. We do collect our seed typically in the later part of the season. So the fall's when the seed's fully matured. My dad always said around Thanksgiving, but you can do a little bit earlier than that. But spring seeds on Japanese maples aren't going to be viable. They're typically not going to be fully developed in that nutlet, so it's not going to be something you're going to want to pull super early.
So this is actually from a cultivar called Ed Carmine, and it's not necessarily one that we might always use for rootstock. We may just look through this and see if we see anything interesting that comes out of these seeds to future propagate. But this process is the exact same way we do with our Acer palmatum subspecies palmatum. Now, we always start off with some Captan or fungicide of some sort. And
you want a little bit more for that size?
Yeah, I'll put some more in there. And
got a lot of seed in here. We gathered these a few weeks ago. Now, a lot of places will stratify their Japanese maple seeds inside in a refrigerator or something like that. You can get as detailed as you want. People will even, you know, pre-stratify them, pre-nick them, do a lot of things. We don't do any of that here at our nursery. We grow a ton from seeds. There's some years where we've grown 150,000 to 200,000 Japanese maples from seed. Now, we don't do any of the fancy stuff. We're not refrigerating all these. These actually have been refrigerated, but because we're in zone 6B here, we let nature do it. So we'll actually put these into these kind of trays, let them stratify outside, and then in mid to late March, we'll start checking to see what we're seeing and removing those that are leafed out. We'll get those trays inside so they're protected.
We're blessed here that a lot of our cold weather naturally stratifies them. And so why go through the process of putting them through a refrigerator and doing that if that's the case? The main thing that's the difference is you got to watch out for varmints. You got mice love to eat your seeds, especially your coolest seeds.
We'll actually take a small screen and put over this when we're putting them outside. And then as it gets closer to winter, or it's closer to spring, we'll actually go through and put a little bit of frost cloth over top of the seed trays to prevent you know, early spring frost damage.
And so what we'll do is we'll just take this, spread this around, and with maple seeds starting off, we literally start this here by just lightly covering it, spreading it out kind of evenly. Now I'll label this whole tray as Ed Carmine because this is a cultivar that we're going to be looking through for seed. But we just lightly spread this dirt, just lightly over it, just barely covering the seed. And then what we'll do is we'll take this, place this outside.
I'll let it get good and wet in, get some of those air pockets out.
We'll take a thin mesh of wire and lay over top of it and put bricks over top of it. And that'll help prevent a lot of squirrels and mice from getting into the seed bed. And then we'll go in and lay a frost cloth over top of that. And then as spring comes in, we'll be watching to see when those seeds start popping up.
And this is just a light layer. It doesn't have to be a lot, but we want to cover up most of it.
Now with the straight species, Acer palmatum, subspecies palmatum, it's a basic green, kind of like what you'd find growing out in the wild. When we're putting that in the seed beds, you know, you can cover it pretty well. If you get into doing seeds of different cultivars, sometimes those don't develop as good or stronger root systems as a seedling. And so you really have to use the germination mix more and more, or just lightly, barely cover the seed so that you're not drowning the seed.
So basically then we're letting that germinate. We're putting them in these kind of band pots and then waiting 2 years for this to kind of get to this level where it's finished off and it's kind of ready to graft to. This kind of size range, typically you can do 1/4 inch. Those are pretty small, but this kind of size range is typically what you want.
Now this is about a 2 to 3 years from seed. So as you can see, we've already got 2 to 3 years in this plant before we're ever doing any of the grafting process. So it takes a lot of time. I mean, that's one of the things that people, they're like, you know, I want a tree, but I want this variety, I want it to go really, really quickly. Well, it takes time. Japanese maples are slow growers, and the whole grafting process, it takes a whole lot of time. So when you have a tree out in the landscape, especially one that hasn't been pruned on, you often get older, twiggy growth. Now, I'm not saying you can't graft that older, twiggier growth, but it's going to take a lot longer to heal. When we're grafting, that's exactly what we're doing. We're making a wound on the plant, and we're letting that heal. This fresh new growth on this plant, that's going to be this 1 to 2 year wood, is going to heal much quicker than that twiggier, older growth. Now, sometimes the twiggier, older growth is all you've got, and that's all you have to work with. And sometimes you have to graft that. But you're going to get a much lower yield on that twiggier, older growth because it's going to take much longer to heal in the process. Now, when you're grafting, it's all about how quickly that can heal so you get a higher success, because that's really what we want. We want all of our work to come to fruition and have the best success when we make each and every graft. So here we've got this really, really fresh new growth. Now, if we were doing this during the summer months, some of this new growth we couldn't use because it'd be too soft. During the winter months, this is all hardened off, so we can actually use all of this, which is fantastic for winter grafting. It's one of the reasons we like doing the winter grafting process. Now, out of this right here, this is Acer palmatum phoenix. This is a great upright tree, really has some good spring interest, and that's what we're producing today. I mean, this is such an amazing plant, and it's got a lot of good wood on it with this fresh new growth. So here we've got Acer palmatum phoenix. We've got lots of fresh new growth. Now what we're looking for when we're grafting is that wood that doesn't have a lot of side branching to it, or that previous year's growth. That previous year's growth is always going to have the highest success of grafting because it's going to heal the quickest. It's the youngest, it's the most rejuvenative, and that's what we're grafting when we're dealing with Japanese maples, is that fresh new growth. Any questions? Yeah, that's an excellent question. Can you take multiple scions from the same plant? Yes. One of these plants right here, I could trim it back probably down to about 2 nodes all across that plant. And when it pushes out growth in the spring, it's going to put out more growth, and maybe even it being taller than some of the plants I didn't prune on. And that's simply because pruning promotes growth. And that's what people often don't realize. But on these 2 branches that I took off that one plant, I can actually graft each of these nodes. So where you see this set of buds, that's 1 node. Often when we're grafting, we like to do 2 sets of nodes if it's, so we've got 4 buds on the plant. But you can actually, if it's something that's rare, something you really want to produce lots of large numbers on, you can actually graft each little spacing interval. So what I've got here in my hands, I could graft 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20. Really could produce 21 plants off of these 2 sticks. So a small plant can often have a really large amount of scion wood. A dwarf plant, something like this tattoo that's down here, it produces very little scion wood. And so often you might not cut that back as heavy because it grows so slowly. I mean, you can cut it back, but it's not going to push out the large amount of growth that some of these larger plants will.
Does that make them more expensive, the dwarf?
Dwarfs are often take longer to produce in a 1 gallon, and often that means that they're going to be smaller, and they may be, you know, for us, $5 more than some of the faster growing varieties.
When you're taking your cuttings, are you paying attention to the size and diameter of the cuttings too?
That's an excellent point. Whenever you're pruning on a Japanese maple and you're grafting, you do have to watch out to make sure that you're not getting scion wood that's larger than your rootstock. On the rootstock that we have selected today, you know, we've got some really large rootstock. So most of the scion wood in here in this greenhouse here would work putting on some of these 1 gallons. But some of the species like Acer japonicum have some really large, thick wood. That's just naturally what that species does. To graft onto that, you're gonna have to use larger rootstock, because we'll get to the point here a little bit later, but this has to be smaller than your rootstock to really have a good success. I mean, it's possible to graft one that's a little bit larger, but it's very difficult. And so why make things more difficult for you? It's always better to get something that's smaller than your rootstock. If you actually get it closer to the size of your rootstock, you're gonna get the largest tree the quickest, but you always have to have it smaller than the thickness of your rootstock. Any other questions? Now, one other thing to note here too, when we're grafting, we're producing a healthy, strong plant. So if you're selecting wood from a plant that's out there that's very slow growing, that's diseased or something, you may also produce that. So keep that in mind, that you always want to produce from your healthy plants, and make sure that your plants that you're grafting from are in great shape, because you don't want to produce from the plants that are sickly. Often people will go out there and they'll say, oh, this plant's about to die on me, I'm gonna go out and graft it. You know, yeah, you might be able to save a plant that way, but you're likely, you could be producing what's wrong with that plant again in the plant tissue. So that's something to keep in mind.
So if if an older tree is dying, it's not worth doing machine things, grafting or local science or this the whole tree.
The question was, can you graft from an old plant that's dying? Yes, you can. And
if you wanted to revive and use the rootstock of like a grandmother tree,
yeah,
old tree, and put fresh stock onto it, are you saying that's a bad idea?
no, no. You can have an old plant out in the landscape and graft fresh scion wood onto it. But typically on a tree, that if a plant's not doing well, it's in the roots. And so most of the time it's not going to be successful for you to do that. Not saying it can't happen, but most of the time it's not going to be very successful. All right, I guess we'll get over to the grafting stage.
So we'll go over some basics for like the terminologies for what we do with grafting. Tim kind of explained to you a little bit about what a scion is, and that's basically the cultivar we're producing onto the new rootstock. Again, rootstock, that's what we're grafting to. We use grafting knives here at our nursery. They're basically a beveled knife that's sharp to one side, the other side's kind of flat. That way you're making a one-sided cut. Now what we do here at our nursery are we do modified side veneer grafts. We find they're one of the very best grafts for cleaning up. They look some of the best long-term. I've done garden shows where people say, like, we took really big material and they said, I don't believe in this grafted. So that's the best compliment you can pay me. We don't want it to look grafted. We want it to look very nice and clean long-term. So one of the reasons we do that side modified or side veneer graft is because it cleans up the best long-term.
Now, with our rootstocks, these here are the straight species. What we're looking for with these rootstocks are something that's very healthy. Again, these are supposed to add vigor to the plant we're grafting, right? We're supposed to adding a good root system and good vigor. If these plants don't have good root systems or don't have good vigor, what's the point of us grafting to them? So good rootstock is always important.
We typically also use a nice pair of bonsai pruners. We use Joshua Roth a lot of times, but we have tons of different bonsai pruners. Grafting rubber bands are a must, not always required, but good. Sometimes we'll cover with like a sealant. Sometimes we'll use a buddy tape, which is like a small wrapping tape. Typically, if we're grafting in summer or fall, we'll use the buddy tape. And a lot of times during the winter, Tim and I will go and use a sealant. You can use whatever you want. One of the things with grafting, if you have, like the worst thing you could ever do to learn about grafting would be have a round table with like 10 grafters, because every single one of them is going to tell you to do it differently. And they're all right, is the honest answer, because you do what works. So you do what works for you, and you do what works in your area. So you can do different variations of this. We've found variations of what we liked and then improved on it. So
it all starts with the rootstock. And the grafting process takes quite a while. These here, we brought them in today. We're not quite ready to set up for grafting yet. But we would bring this plant inside, let it start to dry out. And then we would wait till this actually started getting white rooting. And these don't have it right now, so these actually really wouldn't be time to graft these. They're also too wet. We like them the rootstocks to be moist, but not soaking wet. I mean, these just came out of the rain today. But Japanese maples, we like to see some white roots starting when we pull it out. And that's when we know we've really reached the peak time for grafting, as long as that root system isn't soaking wet.
Now we typically do the majority of our grafting here at our nursery from January through early March. Once the scions have started to leaf out and they start to get high sap in what you're grafting, it really doesn't work. They're not going to be turgid enough really to be placed on there, and they're going to transpire too quickly to work as a scion at that point.
Now,
there's some other tools you can use. A lot of people talk about these grafting guns. They work for fruit plants. They don't really work for Japanese maples. You're dealing with too small of a cambium. So while we have some of these for fun, really, they don't really work for Japanese maples.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Now, during this whole process, one of the main things is cleanliness. We're making wounds on a plant. We're wanting to make sure that all of our stuff, our trimmers, our knives, our plants, don't have fungus on them, because that fungus will stop the plant from healing or increase the amount of time it takes to heal. So, even during this process, we may go through with some Zero-Tol at 3% and go around and spray around as a preventative measure, even on the rootstocks, even before we ever start our grafting process.
Now, we like to use those bonsai pruners as opposed to like the hammer pruners, because you're going to get a cleaner cut and you're not going to leave more damaged wood there when you're cutting them. You can cut your scions or something like that with that, but you're gonna need to clean it up. Now, one thing we also do is we clean our trimmers between every single set. So if we're grafting a set of Phoenix here, before we cut out another tree, we're gonna go ahead and clean our trimmers with like rubbing alcohol so that we're not spreading any funguses from plant to plant. And it's also gonna help in that healing process that we're not bringing in bacteria from everything. And then we're spreading it to 20,000 trees with our one grafting knife. So.
Now, say we've got white rooting and the plants have dried out. We're going to get into the next step of the process, because this is what we always talk about. People call it the blades of glory, but honestly enough, if you don't have your rootstock right,
nothing else matters.
Nothing else matters. So the pre-care and the aftercare are 90% of grafting. The actual grafting process, the actual cutting of it, probably about 10%.
Yeah. And if you go into nurseries and you look at the guys that make the big bucks, they're the guys that do the pre-care and the post-care. And your cheapest labor is typically doing the cut, because that's the least important part. Like if you do everything else right, that's gonna take. It's the part everybody glorifies and it makes the most, you know, everybody's like, wow, teach us grafting, and everybody wants to come here and sit in on the part where you're doing the actual grafting. And that's actually the easiest part. That pre-care and post-care are the most important things. Y'all are lucky, by the way. We quit doing our grafting classes. We've been doing them sometimes for the Ralston as a fundraiser, and we haven't done a ton. My new thing is everybody says, I want to come on your grafting. Like that's like our, like we get that like every week. And so our new thing is like, we're going to Mr. Miyagi everybody. Like you come and pull weeks for a weed, pull weeds for a week, and then we will teach you the first step. and then pull weeds for a second week, and then we'll go through some more grafting.
So often we'll cut a lot of these rootstocks down a little bit because we're grafting a low graft. Now, some lace leaf varieties, weeping varieties, we may graft higher. So on those rootstocks, we're gonna leave them a little bit higher, because those grafts, if you wanted to graft them higher and let them cascade down, you can do that a little bit higher. But since we're doing an upright variety called Phoenix, it's got a great spring color, we're gonna cut these back a little bit. And I often will come back here and cut them about yay high. We'll take off those side branches. And then go ahead and I'll dispose of that. And that's just cleans up the table a little bit and gives me some room to work.
Yeah, we'll actually start out with some of the Ginkgos. So we'll do the same over here. We're gonna graft a couple Ginkgos for you. Again, we're not into our main production season, so we're not actually heavy into production yet. I mean, our chances of takes are low on these because we don't have the white rooting going on. Another thing that's real important if you're going to teach a grafting class, get you a thing so you look important, so you can carry it up and be like, I've got my suitcase. But we kind of keep all our supplies together. It keeps us from losing them. Again, sometimes the year, like as we actually get into winter production, we'll actually use a product like a tree coat or a Doc Farwell's when we'll be painting over the graft. And you can do whatever you prefer. Again, a lot of people do different things, but we use the buddy tape a lot of times for like summer production. Really the humidity on that graft is one of the key things.
Now you'll notice too, our rubber band here, this is a very thick rubber band. We like using these. There are thinner rubber bands out there you can get as well, but they often will cut into a plant. And so we like using this because the width of this doesn't seem to have that choking-like effect on the grafts. And often this will deteriorate, this specific rubber band, and fall off naturally almost by itself.
Yeah. Corbin, if you want to come around on this side of me, I'll do a couple cuts. Might be a good way to get a good shot of the cuts. And y'all can all come up closer too if everybody wants to get in here a little bit more. I know it's easier to see. Now again, we do a basic modified side veneer graft. So we're going to take a Ginkgo to Ginkgo here. You know, you're going to need the same species for good success. There are a few exceptions in maples where you can graft across sections, but you're still going to be, you're not going to be able to graft, you know, people ask questions like, well, can I graft my maples to Acer rubrums? No, it's not going to work. So you're going to have a Japanese maple to graft in there, and you're going to have a Ginkgo to graft a Ginkgo too. Certain things even require different understocks. So if you're grafting a trident maple, it's going to require specific trident maple understocks. It's not going to be on the same palmatum because they're slightly in a different section. So,
but that's really important too, is making sure that what you're grafting can work. I mean, you don't want to sit here and graft 20,000 grafts all winter and then realize that you use the wrong root system.
Right. We've done everything wrong, so we're just giving you some tips for how we do it right. Tim and I've got a couple knives, and we hadn't even sharpened these a lot for this year. One of the key advices I'll give you is to have a very sharp knife. You want to have a grafted knife that's properly maintained and isn't super dull. If you get a super dull grafted knife, you're going to be doing grafting. If you're ever grafting and you see somebody like back up because that's going haywire in through there. We've taught some classes. We've had some bloodshed in those classes that we've taught. Yeah, there's been some bloodshed. We're serious. I often say, you know, the first rule of thumb is don't cut your thumb. And when you're starting grafting, it's very likely you're going to cut your thumb. In fact, when I was getting started early on, we did 10,000 that first year. And I would actually rubber band and put like a Band-Aid around that on my thumb. So I had like a nice landing spot for that knife when I was cutting. Now, the key for cutting your scion, again, we do a modified side veneer graft. So we're going to create a 2-point wedge. And so we're going to be cutting both sides of our scion. And then we're going to be making an incision into this for that wedge to lay into. So that little modified side veneer graft is going to go into our flap here. We're going to tie it on with a rubber band and put a little buddy tape around it today because we're just going simple. But again, you can go as big as you want with the process. Now, ginkgos are really easy to graft too. So it's one of the things we often start people out on when we're learning to graft.
Yeah, fruit trees and ginkgos are more simple to graft than, say, a Japanese maple. Part of that's because Japanese maples have a very thin cambium, where something like a ginkgo has a much larger cambium.
So I'm going to make a small modified side veneer graft. I hold my scion wood, so I'm not having to cut through a set of buds. So I'm actually cutting between the buds. So I've got a nice little straight piece here. And I try to hold things as evenly as I can. I actually cut like this in front of myself, and then I'll make a rotated cut here. I typically go larger on one side and slightly smaller on the second side to give that modified side veneer. It's interestingly enough, by doing that second cut, sometimes you'll get a take only on the back side of the graft. So it helps increase yields. But again, I'm going to make a small modified side veneer graft on this. And we haven't really prepped these. A lot of times we'll prepare the water amount for each cut too. So the first cut I've done there, not a great cut. One of my first ones of the year. Knife's a little dull too, but we'll create that slight wedge going on there. And then we'll match it on the other side. Slightly smaller cut on the secondary side. And again, ginkgos are super forgiving because they're very easy to graft. And so basically what we have is a small wedge going on there. This side slightly larger than this side. And we're going to create an area on our rootstock to put the larger side and leave that secondary side here with our other part of the cambium. Now you'll see that little green part in there. That's actually the cambium there. So that little green part you're seeing is the part you have to line up. And if you don't line up those parts, everything else is for nothing. So you got to line those parts up to kind of make it all work. Now what I do when I'm doing this, I typically hold my rootstock like this, and I'll create a very low incision. I'm actually going a little deeper on this one for demonstration purposes, but you don't want to cut deeply into your plant. If you're cutting very deeply in your plant, you've missed the cambium layer. You're not where things are lining up. So I've created like a small wedge in here. If you can even see it on camera, but. And what I do is I actually tie my rubber bands when I'm putting on my scion.
Here's this pass around if y'all want to sort of see.
But in a pretty good graft, you want things to line up like that without even having to rubber band them. And you don't have to line up both sides, but one side has to be touching. Like you see on this side, well, I'll shake it around, drop it off. It's not touching on the back side there, but you have to have one side perfectly lined up.
The biggest thing
before you tie your rubber band.
The biggest thing you don't want to do here is line it up in the center, because then it's lined up. It's not lined up on either side. And so that's one thing to always keep in mind, is you always have to line it up on one side. Often people will try to say, I'll split the difference. Well, then you're not lined up on either side.
Now, typically when I'm tying my rubber band, I would close this area off so you can't see through it. I'm tying this one open so we can pass it around so you can kind of see into where we grafted. So I left a little bit more space in there. But that one you can kind of see into some.
Now, our knives were a little dull whenever we
super dull right
whenever
now.
we were cutting those. One thing you may have saw me do is I didn't like my first cut, so I started back and went back above it.
Above that one's had a
cut.
That one's still like factory cut on that.
What?
That was
Yeah.
still the factory
Yeah, I know.
sharpened.
And when I don't like a cut, I have to start all the way back up here at the beginning again. If you start here and you start whittling, you'll never get a flat cut. So you have to start back through and get a full solid cut all the way through that's nice and flat. If you start in the middle, you're just going to keep whittling and make it uneven. So definitely don't do that. It's always best to start back at the very top and work yourself all the way through. Man, these things are dull.
Pretty dull. I'll do another one here just for demonstration purposes. In a really busy day, if I have somebody setting up my scion wood and I'm not going in search of scion wood and in search of rootstock and I'm grafting, I'll do about 500 to 600 a day in a really busy day. That'd be really fast going through it. And that's like, you know, that's pretty good pace. But
now, the one thing you don't want on these is to have a spoon effect. If you have a spoon effect where you cut down and then you you're loosening your pressure, you've created a spoon, and when you line that up on there, you're gonna have a space in between the rootstock and your cut. So that's one thing to always keep in mind. You always want as flat of a cut on your wedges as possible.
now, rubber band tying can be kind of tricky. What I typically do, it's like tying a balloon. I'll take a rubber band, I'll create a start to it like that and hold it down with my finger here, and I wrap up the tree, and then I go back down. I don't leave the pressure at the top. A lot of times you'll see people go up and tie it off. I don't want a simple tool creating a wedge pulling my graft off. So I take the pressure and tie it off back down low. And that way, you know, you've got a little bit more space there. Now what we'll actually do once these trees leaf out, so these are Ginkgo biloba American. That's a dwarf little Ginkgo we've grafted on here. And we could put those on a standard. We could graft them higher up or lower. That's what a standard is. We'll come back in the spring and typically reduce this understock to about here. When this starts to leaf out, we'll start, I'm sorry, bum right was grafted. And we'll start to let some humidity get in there. So we'll have them in humidity tents oftentimes, and we'll start to get a little less humidity. We'll start to break that up, get some more natural airflow, start to wean it off the area it's in and get it more regulated for our natural environment. Now before we pot them up, we're gonna cut completely the rootstock down here and allow that scion to be the uppermost part and go on from there. So as we finish that process out, we'll remove our sap stump here completely, and then from there on, we'll have American.
So one thing on cutting the rootstock, I just want to reiterate here, you don't want to cut too deep into the rootstock. Often what we see, the mistake people make when they get cut and they hurt themselves, is they start cutting through the rootstock and their hand's behind it. And they cut through the rootstock too deep, they cut their hand on the back side. So always keep that in mind. One, the deeper you cut, the longer it's gonna take for that plant to heal. Yes, you can have success cutting a deep cut, but you're likely to cut yourself, and it's gonna take longer to heal. So the thinner cut that you can make is always gonna make the cleanest and easiest graft to heal, and also it's gonna be the safest. So you always wanna be on that edge, and you don't wanna be cutting through the center of that plant. It's gonna just take a lot longer for that plant to heal than one that's lightly cut.
So these are little pieces of paraffin wax. They're called buddy tape. And oftentimes, especially in the summer, we'll get these off here and stretch them. And we put it on basically the same way as the rubber band, but it basically just makes a little bandage area for that scion to be nestled into. Sometimes I'll even, this one's not really gonna tighten off that way. I'll come up and go in between with it. But it's just basically a little protective area to give that, stuff's probably been in too much sun. But we'll tighten it up on it and give it a little Band-Aid over top of the graft there. And that can be a substitute to, a tree coat type thing. We went to a tree coat because it essentially accomplished the same objective, but we didn't have any temperature controls to worry about there with our wax temperature.
Now there are multiple things to do, but one of the most important things during this process, especially if you've got as many different varieties as what we have, is labeling. We often have labels that we've printed, but for today, I'm just simply writing a label and labeling this. And that way we know exactly what we've got when this actually takes. And pencil always works better than this, but again, we normally use our label printer, the same labels you see hanging on our plants. We're labeling it right now at this point of graft.
If the rootstock starts developing growth on it, do you trim that off pretty quickly?
So when this leaves out in the spring, it will. So this will have some buds and stuff on it, and it can still energy from this. What I'll do is I'll typically come in and make my first cut even when my scion are slightly below. So I'll come in here and remove this down to about here, and that'll cut out a little bit of that. And I will take off some of the branching at that point if I see it just by hand. And then eventually I'll remove it all together down here. Now you will have to make sure to take out any buds you see below the graft, especially when they're young. So some of the things we do around here, Wesley will be going around making sure to cut all of any of the growth going on below the graft. Typically once you cut that for a season or two and it's lower, it doesn't tend to be an issue, but it is something you always want to watch out for, that your understock doesn't overtake the top of your plant.
So we went through a little bit of this. the main thing you want to watch out for at this point is making sure that rootstock doesn't take over. I mean, if that rootstock keeps growing, it will actually take energy away from the graft, and the graft itself won't grow and will sometimes die off if the rootstock starts getting too vigorous and you leave that rootstock on too long. Any questions before we get into?
You have one of the videos we had to watch, the grafted scion, dude, grafted with wax, but I've seen both ways now, so that's not necessary.
No.
To wrap your scion. It's not going to whip water away from you.
We quit using the wax, like I was telling her, just basically because it can be a temperature control thing.
I mean, you were using it around the graft, but you never have to wrap the entire
We've never wrapped the entire scion.
I never have. I've seen people do it. You probably saw a video from Peggy DeHarmon, who's a good friend of ours. We used to go teach a grafting class down at Pat Dye, who's the former Auburn football coach's place. And Peggy's a grafter who, if you Google it on YouTube, you'll probably find some of her grafting videos. And she typically wraps the whole scion. I've heard benefits to both. I've never done it that way, but some people do.
I'll tell you the biggest issue I've had with wax is temperature. You have to keep close watch on your temperature gauge because you can actually burn your scion and burn your graft. And because of that, we went away from wax and started moving more towards tree coat. When we're using tree coat, because it's one less thing that one less variable we have to watch. If you're sitting there grafting all day and you miss checking your temperature on your wax, you can mess up your whole day's worth of grafting. And because of that, tree coat does the same thing, and we just simply went to doing tree coat on the scion whenever we're grafting. You can even just do the buddy tape. I mean, even some winter grafters use just the buddy tape and a rubber band.
If you're in a production standpoint and you're at a big nursery, they're never going to wrap the whole scion on this, just because production-wise, it's going to cost a lot more money to do 10,000 grafts all the way in buddy tape. And I don't think it's necessary.
You're not painting you said you are using the tree coat after this? Or?
We typically are just around the same area. So we'll use it around the base here, but we're not covering the entire scion in it.
And how do you apply that? What is that?
Just a paintbrush. Like it's a water-soluble mix. So typically like Doc Farwell's will use a lot, or Tree Coat, or two of the brands. And those are brands of basically a small sealant. It really doesn't matter which one. And again, you can easily use wax. My dad always used a small little boiler with a peanut can with wax, beeswax in the peanut can, and an X-Acto knife. So these aren't exactly the way you have to do it. Again, he would dip it in there and put the paint or the wax, just brushing around the graft union there, covering that. Now, if you have an inner piece instead of a terminal bud here, you'd want to seal that off as well at the tip. So say we cut a piece off of this and we did something like this. We always typically leave 2 sets of nodes for a maple. But say we came in here and we cut that there, we typically would seal that off as well when we put it into the graft section. But, if it's a terminal bud, there's no reason to apply wax anymore.
The whole thing that we're doing with the sealant is we're preventing that scion from losing moisture. That same thing can be accomplished a lot with the buddy tape. Mm-hmm. You still would need to add some sealant to the terminal buds, but you can simply use buddy tape to keep that plant from those scion from losing moisture as well. And a lot of nurseries some nurseries don't even use rubber band and just use buddy tape, and only buddy tape alone, which is more than I'm willing to do. I like to do the rubber band because I can make sure that it stays exactly where I put it.
All right. We'll do a few maples for you guys as well. So I'll go ahead and cut. Same principles, same process applies. Now you're going to want to cut between your buds. You can slice buds open to graft if you have to. Some varieties like Makawi Yatsubusa are very tight internoding, so the budding's very close together. It's kind of clustered, and it's actually going to require you to cut through buds to then graft that variety. So most don't, though. Most you get some spacing like this on your scion. I typically like at least 4 buds on my scion. If one bud's damaged or something, you still have some points to take there. If you graft scion wood without buds, I wouldn't recommend it. I've seen it done. I've done it myself. I've had one chance at something. It can happen, but you have to force a bud to form in the spring. I've seen, Dutch producers say, "Oh, you don't need the buds." Yeah, but it sure helps. It sure helps. If you don't have any buds, your chances of getting a take go way down. So if you ever ask for scion from somebody and they send you those pieces, oh man, you're not set up for success on that at all. Now you'll actually have those same kind of node sections of growth on your rootstock, and I tend to graft between those. Typically when we cut that rootstock back, it's going to dry down to that set of kind of little chambered area there you see. And by cutting below this part, we're going to kind of give this tree a nice place for that sap stump to naturally dry back to.
Now, when we're making these cuts, we're doing the exact same type thing that we're doing with the Ginkgo. Sharper the knife, the better. I mean, you're dealing with a tool. A dull knife, like these are right now, they're likely going to get you cut.
Here's a scion. Not a perfect cut, but kind of gives you an example there. Again, these are some of our first ones of the year, and we really didn't get all of our equipment set up perfect for this, but again, you kind of want to have something with two sets of buds like that. You can use the in-growth only, but doesn't require that. With maples, you can certainly use this inside growth as well. And we're just going to make little small side veneer wedges on these.
And people make different rules on how long the cut should be for you. Some Dutch nurseries will use a cut that's about that long. Now that's a cut that's that long is going to stand out on a younger plant and be more obvious than something that's a little bit shorter. But if you get too short, it's just less area for that plant to be able to heal over that side.
With Japanese maples, it's going to be very important that your cambium lines up. There's a smaller cambium. The smaller the cambium on your plant, typically the harder it is to graft. So like oaks and Japanese maples and things like that can be some of your hardest plants to graft. Fruit trees have huge cambiums. You can just point them at each other and they take. But you know, Japanese maples, especially that point where you're lining up the cambiums, are very important. So what I've done here is I've kind of just pinched that one off. If you can kind of see right there, it could fall out of there, but it's got a nice little pocket that's in there. And it's going to kind of sit there, and we're just giving it somewhere to sit and heal. I'll go ahead and put the rubber band on this one. Again, I'll tie this one so you can see into it. And then we'll pass this one around. Normally I tie them where you don't see into them, but you can see into this one a little bit, just so you can kind of see where that graft's lined up. Now the graft's lined up to this side. My dad's left-handed, and both Tim and I are right-handed, so I can go around and tell you which trees each of us have grafted. So if it's aligned to the right side, I probably know where it came from there.
I'm going to let you do most of the cutting because that one needs a lot of sharpening.
There you go. Super easy to do though. It's an interesting process with grafting. The keys really are the cleanliness. Now we're going to typically take our grafts from this stage to some humidity tents or areas where they can keep that humidity high around the plant. We don't introduce a lot of exterior humidity. In our area, you get a nice, moisture during the winter anyway, so we're not actually increasing the temperatures there, or the humidity there, but we are going to watch those temperatures. We're going to protect the trees when they're below freezing once they've started to leaf. And the closer they are to springtime, the easier it is, because some of those will heal very quickly. So it's one of the reasons we like to do winter propagation.
So you're going to put these, they're going to stay in a greenhouse. Are you adding heat? Like, are you heating the greenhouse area?
Only when they're below freezing.
Only below freezing,
okay. Some nurseries now, if we were doing a perfect setup, we would probably have some bottom heat that started our roots activating. Okay. We can get by with putting them in a drier house and getting those roots activated and kind of scheduling it. In a perfect scenario, your roots are kind of getting activated on their own. You can force that with some bottom heat, but not required. As long as you're getting some activation on the root system and it's starting to get there, you're going to get good takes. That's really the key, is that the rootstock's activated and not too wet. And then once we've grafted the tree, we're not going to water it a lot until it starts to leaf out. Overwatering during that time can flood the scion, make the graft flush out too heavily. It can actually combust the graft by having too much water. Some of our earliest mistakes were then, okay, great, let's water this thing and get it leafed out. And this really isn't a perfect union here. This isn't taking up energy as efficiently as it will. So we want to control our water amount to a minimum until this is a good, healthy take there.
And we can actually take this here during this time of the season. This is buddy tape, B-U-D-D-Y tape. Yep. And then we just take this, and you can actually take this around, stretch it around the same area over top of the graft.
It doesn't require a greenhouse, but it sure helps. For the home grafter, you have to control the water amount a little bit. Oftentimes you can put a little baggie over the scion to create that same humidity. I mean, I've seen people in nurseries graft with grocery bags and put a grocery bag over the scion wood to create that humidity around the area. Years when we've gotten really fancy, we've set up callus pipes. We've had an entire callus pipe system where the graft has stayed on a heated coil, and that's created a warming section here to increase the speed of the graft union. You can get as fancy with it as you want, but these are some of the basics of what we do.
So if you notice here with this buddy tape, I wrapped it around the graft union, and then I actually pulled it up in between and created almost like a tent over top of that spot.
Just to kind of wick some of the water away from inside that union.
Yep.
I typically like to paint during the winter. I don't know why, it just seems to work better for us. Like I'll put the sealant on there,
and even if I did this, I would still typically like to come in here and put a little bit of paint there and there, the little spots there, and even on top here on the terminal. Now the spot you don't want to paint is your top of your rootstock, because
you need the sap to come out there.
You need the sap to be able to flow out there.
So you don't want to seal this off. I've seen people seal this off, and what you're doing is you're putting too much pressure here. You know, the floods come arising, and then there's too much pressure on your scion, so it might.
You can actually flood off your graft, which is something that often happens when people overwater, or they get their rootstocks too active before the healing process has actually happened.
I'll do another one of the grafts here. If you hand me one of those palmatums, we'll give you a kind of a. If y'all want to even get closer, I'll kind of give you a close-up view. You can even come over my shoulder here. We'll kind of give you a close-up view of what we do here on this, and Tim can answer any questions while I'm doing this part too. But again, we're just creating a small modified side veneer graft. And oftentimes, especially when you got a dull knife, you got to clean those up a little bit. We'll do this one on 3 just to show you a little bit longer one.
And we both have dull knives, but that knife is considerably sharper than this one. This one still has a factory edge. I'm
gonna put my wedge here. Now again, during this stage, you don't want to be pushing down. You don't want to be going right to left. You want to make one small cut. And the cleaner your cut is, you already have a one-sided knife. So the knife is kind of sharp on this side, kind of dull on this side, but you've created a situation where you only want to be making one smooth cut. So I actually let the knife do all the work.
And we often start with the knife at the base and then move the knife away. Literally all we're doing is we are moving the knife from right to left and allowing the knife to cut. We're not putting a whole lot of pressure on the back of it. The more pressure you make and put down on it, the more likely you are to cut through it and cut your hand on the other side.
One time we did this for PBS, so no pressure, right? we're doing this on camera with like Growing a Greener World here for...
we did it for Japan too.
Yeah. The Joe Gardner one, we had, the cameras right here, and it's like, the whole crew, and you're like, man, make sure to get that right. But so that's basically our modified side veneer graft. Again, we're going to reduce that understock as this starts to leaf out, and then we're going to cut it off down here. We're going to look for any suckers coming out from below the graft, and then once this is healed completely, we're going to remove the rubber band. A lot of the rubber bands will break off on their own. Some of these big, sturdy ones we like to use don't. So a lot of times when we're in the potting process down there, they'll be labeling and taking off those rubber bands, so that's not. I've actually had these thick ones stay on until like 3 gallons.
But the good thing is they don't choke them.
Yeah.
You were talking about a callus pipe. Do you still do that?
We do. It's important for plants that have a much slower healing rate. So we do that especially when we graft sugar maples. So we do some different cultivars of sugar maples and things like that. Oaks are incredibly slow to heal. So beeches, some with evergreens, but they don't really do the callus pipe. There's a slightly different procedure for that. The humidity is a little more important. But we do, it's slightly different on everything. And so you'll find not everything's the same. This is how we graft our maples and our ginkgos. But it's a little bit different on everything. Conifers require, a whole litany of different understocks. You're gonna have to match up the needle count there with the understock. So certain needle types are gonna require the same needle type understock. It can get quite tricky the more types of plants you're producing. Things like Fagus sylvatica, which are beeches, those will typically require a callus pipe. You're basically going to have to put those in an area so that they heal quicker than they would naturally. And we have a whole, maybe we'll make a video when we build our callus pipe this year, but we kind of have the callus pipe on a budget method. We need to go ahead and build us, now that we've grown, we need to actually build us like a nice permanent callus pipe house.
We use soil warming cables.
Warming cables.
Soil warming
You
cables.
also take a small pipe inside the big pipe.
That's the better way to do it.
Hot water.
Much better way to do it. It's more consistent with a hot water heater that's running it. You can get a more consistent temperature. We've used PVC insulation before and used the circle. Had little, they're basically laying like this on each side with the heat right here. And there's a heated section of a tube that's right here, and It's just holding the grafts inside there. I mean, it's almost counterproductive with Japanese maples because you might be bumping your graft more than it's worth. It's already going to heal. Especially with ginkgos, it would be counterproductive. But certain types of plants do require a little bit more help to kind of get them there. Any other questions?
And so the more you get into this, the more you realize you're so much more to learn. There are certain types of Japanese maples that you'll have better success when you're grafting them during certain parts of the season. And
every year you get humbled. I mean, sometimes, you know, we typically get 85% plus on our grafts if we're having everything pretty good. And then one year you'll graft one specific cultivar and you'll get like 10%. You're like, man. And then it's funny, you'll talk to people on the West Coast and they had a really low yield on the same cultivar that year. So there's all kinds of different factors that can factor into why something didn't work great. But you get humbled no matter what. Now, people get oddly specific. we would go to the grafting seminars with some friends, and people would be like, I get 82.7%. You're like, oh, okay. And you're like, what do you get? They're like, I'm 96.8. What about you, Matt? And I'm like, so Pat Dye, he's deceased now, but good friend of ours, and he always, he loved to hear about people's different percentages. He said, Matt, what's your percentage? And everybody had just been upping those numbers. I mean, they're like ridiculously specific, right? And so first off, it's kind of like leading the league in scoring. You got to put up enough shots to get a percent. If you're doing 100 grafts, like, yeah, you can say I got 82%. It's pretty easy. But if you're doing 20,000 grafts, you know, there's a little bit more shots involved there to get that percentage up. So there's things like that. Well, Pat's like, well, Matt, he gets 92%. What happened with you? And I'm like, you're not going to believe it. This year we got 120%. Some of them fell over and grew together. Like, I didn't even touch them. But so there's always a lot of good exaggeration that goes on amongst grafters. But the truth of the matter is, you find what works for you and let that work. Because in different areas, it's going to be completely different.
Is everything y'all sell grafted?
Well, no. We do some cultivars from seed. We do some rooted cuttings for bonsai. The vast majority of our name varieties are grafted. Again, we do a whole video on why trees are grafted. Typically, it's kind of think of it like breeds of dogs. So like with a grafted Japanese maple, you're not going to get a Great Dane when you wanted a Chihuahua. You're going to kind of know what to expect, and you're going to lock in those traits so you have kind of a guaranteed idea of what it's going to be. Now, from seed, some could look like the parent plant, some could look completely different. So maples don't come true from seed. So if you're growing them from seed, you can still get a great plant, but it's kind of like a mutt. It might be a great mutt, but you don't really know what you got until it's finished. So.
And with Japanese maples from rooted cutting, they're more likely to catch disease and Pseudomonas. And those are things that can clog the xylem flow and basically cause almost like plant diabetes. Keep them from getting the nutrients they need from the roots up to the upper parts of the plant. And so that can cause some really detrimental effects to the plant. And because of that, you don't want your rootstock to be rooted, and you don't want your plant to be rooted. You want to start a tree from seed and then graft to it with the Japanese maple.
It can work great for bonsai or container culture where you have a controlled environment, but they're way more likely to pick up disease than a properly grafted healthy maple. A properly grafted healthy Japanese maple should live to be well over 100 years old. So. Any other questions?
Why are you saying it's a modified side veneer graft?
So a typical side veneer graft would just be one-sided. So a side veneer graft would kind of look something, I'll clean that one up. This would be, and you can chip bud ginkgos, you can do a ton of different production methods. But your typical side veneer graft is going to look like that. So with the modified side veneer graft, we've created 2 surface areas for cambium there, and we've increased our take. Sometimes with a take, the only part that took's that back flap right there, and not necessarily the part closest to the rootstock. And so with the modified side veneer graft, we've just give ourselves a little bit more percentage increaser than the one-sided veneer graft.
You said one of them's longer than the other. The longer side of the cut is against the rootstock.
That's typically how we do it. I've seen people do it other ways. I mean, that's typically how I do it, but I've seen both done. I've seen great nurserymen who grow thousands of maples completely contradict each other on each step we just said.
But,
so it can happen.
But the truth is whenever you're making your cuts, you'll find cuts you like better than others. And whichever cut's the flattest cut, it's the least amount of spoon, that's the side that needs to go against the rootstock. Because that's the side that's going to take.
It's the flattest surface. Cool. Thank y'all for coming. I hope you enjoyed our little demonstration here. And yeah.
And if any of y'all are interested in jobs, contact Miss Jody. Our email's on our website.
That's very good.
Yep.
Thanks.
Very much. This was really cool. Thank you.
Hey y'all, I hope you all enjoyed today's video so y'all can understand the full process of what we go through to create these trees, to get these trees to grow in your garden.
It's a little bit of a behind the scenes look at how grafting works. We'll probably do a more in-depth full grafting video this winter when we have everything set up. But we wanted to get this on camera because we had a class here and we're teaching them small level production. So we wanted to show you guys what goes on there. If you like Japanese maples, you gotta subscribe to the Mr. Maple Show. If Japanese maples are fun, share this content, like it, and make sure to get it out to other gardening friends that you think might be crazy like us and passionate about this type of thing.
Thank you all so much for watching today. Make sure you subscribe to our weekly emails on MrMaple.com. We add at least 10 new trees every single Tuesday at 10 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. You'll want to be signed up for that email.
Take care
God bless.
and have a great day.